The power grid dies at 3:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, and you're standing in your kitchen staring at your phone as the screen goes black, and suddenly the hum you've lived with your entire life, that electrical buzz that's been the soundtrack to modern civilization, just stops. And in that silence, you realize something that makes your stomach drop like you've been shoved off a cliff. All that gold you bought, those shiny coins you hid in your safe, those bars you bragged about at dinner parties. They're about to become the most expensive paperweights in human history, because when the supermarket shelves empty in 72 hours and your neighbor's kids are crying from hunger, nobody's going to trade you a can of beans for a chunk of metal they can't eat, can't drink, and can't use to keep the darkness away. You think you're prepared because some YouTube prepper told you precious metals are the ultimate store of value. But here's the physics lesson they forgot to mention. Value isn't intrinsic. It's not some magical property embedded in atoms of gold. Value is a collective hallucination that only works when everyone agrees to keep hallucinating together, and the moment survival becomes more important than speculation. That hallucination shatters like glass. Now let's talk about what actually matters when the currency system collapses. And I'm not talking about a recession or a stock market correction. I'm talking about the kind of collapse where the Venezuelan mother trades a fish for a bag of flour, because that's the only way her kids eat that night. Where toilet paper becomes more valuable than someone's entire day of labor, and where a can of beans is worth more than the diploma you spent 4 years and $50,000 earning. You need to understand the hierarchy of human needs, because your survival depends on understanding what other humans will kill for when the veneer of civilization peels away like old paint, and brother, spoiler alert, they're not killing for your gold coins. Abraham Maslow spent his career documenting what humans actually need in order of priority. And it's not complicated. Physiological needs sit at the bottom of the pyramid: breathing, water, food, shelter, and when those are threatened, every other concern. Including your investment portfolio becomes absolutely meaningless. This is biology, not philosophy, and biology doesn't negotiate. So here's the brutal truth about the 5 categories of items that become the new currency, and why your stockpile better include them if you want to survive past month 3 of the collapse. First category: fire and light. And before you roll your eyes and think this is obvious, let me explain why 90% of preppers still get this catastrophically wrong. The myth is that you'll just rub 2 sticks together, or use a magnifying glass when you need fire, like you're some kind of wilderness expert who watched a survival show once. The reality is that starting fire with primitive methods in wet conditions requires skill you don't have, time you won't have, and physical energy you'll be desperately conserving because you're already calorie deficient. Here's your science drop. The human body in a temperate climate burns roughly 2,000 calories per day, just existing, and that number skyrockets when you're cold, because thermodynamics is a merciless master. Your body is a biological furnace that must maintain 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and when ambient temperature drops, your metabolic rate increases exponentially to generate heat through shivering thermogenesis. This process is so energy-intensive that people have died from hypothermia with full stomachs, because they simply ran out of metabolic fuel. Fire isn't just about comfort. It's about not dying from exposure. It's about purifying water so you don't die from dysentery. It's about cooking food so you don't die from parasites. And it's about psychological security, because humans are literally hardwired after 200,000 years of evolution to feel safe near fire. The amygdala in your brain relaxes when you see flames, because fire meant your ancestors lived another night. You think your fancy waterproof matches and Zippo lighter make you prepared, adorable. Let's do the math on why you're still going to fail. A standard Bic lighter provides approximately 3,000 lights before the fuel runs out. Sounds impressive until you realize that in a grid-down scenario, you're lighting fires for cooking 3 times per day, for heat during cold nights, for boiling water, and for light. That's easily 6 to 8 lights per day minimum, which means your single lighter lasts maybe 12 to 14 months if you're lucky and don't lose it or break it. Now multiply that by every person in your family or group, and suddenly you need dozens of lighters just to make it through year 1. And this is why lighters become currency, because everyone needs them, everyone runs out of them. And producing them requires industrial chemical processes that won't exist anymore. The solution is to stockpile cheap disposable lighters by the gross. They cost pennies in bulk. They store indefinitely if kept dry, and they're small enough that you can hide them everywhere, under floorboards and walls, buried in waterproof containers, scattered across multiple locations. Because diversification isn't just an investment strategy, it's a survival imperative. But let's talk about the barter value specifically, because this is where it gets interesting from an economic anthropology perspective. In collapsed economies throughout history, from Weimar Germany into Zimbabwe to Venezuela, physical items that enable immediate survival functions become the de facto currency, because they have what economists call high marginal utility, meaning the difference between having one and having zero is literally the difference between life and death. A lighter in your hand can boil water that saves you from cholera. A lighter you can trade might get you antibiotics that save your child from infected wound. This is why a 500 pack of Bic lighters costing you maybe $75 today could be worth more than your entire retirement account tomorrow. You'll trade one lighter for things people would laugh at you for today. A dozen eggs, a bag of rice, an hour of manual labor, a piece of information about which roads are controlled by which armed groups, because in the moment of need, people pay whatever they must. Second category, food and water purification. And I'm not talking about your freeze-dried Mountain House meals or your fancy Berkey filter. I'm talking about the unsexy items that actually enable you to make water safe and food edible when everything else fails. Here's the myth that's going to kill you. You think you'll just boil all your water and you'll be fine. The mockery begins now. You're going to boil water, really. With what fuel? You're going to chop down every tree in a 5-mile radius and carry hundreds of pounds of wood back to your location every single week while you're already weakened from calorie restriction, and while armed groups are patrolling for people stupid enough to make smoke signals that advertise resources here. Let's talk about the thermodynamics of boiling water. Because apparently nobody teaches physics anymore. Water has a specific heat capacity of 4.18 joules per gram per degree Celsius, which means it takes massive amounts of energy to bring water from ambient temperature to boiling, to purify 1 gallon of water. Roughly 3.78 kilograms, you need to raise it approximately 80 degrees Celsius, which requires over 1.26 megajoules of energy. That's equivalent to burning roughly 40 to 50 grams of dry wood per gallon. And that's assuming perfect efficiency, which you'll never achieve in an open fire. Now let's calculate your daily wood requirements and watch your boiling plan collapse under basic arithmetic. A human needs roughly half a gallon of water per day, absolute minimum for drinking, but that's just to avoid dying of dehydration. For cooking, washing wounds, and basic hygiene, you need closer to 2 gallons per day. Per person, multiply that by 4 people in a family, and you're looking at 8 gallons per day, which means you need to gather, process, and burn roughly 300 to 400 grams of dry wood every single day just for water. Over a month, that's 9 to 12 kilograms of wood. Over a year, that's over 100 kilograms. And that's just for water purification, not including cooking or heating. And here's the part that breaks your plan completely. Dry seasoned wood contains about 15 to 20 megajoules per kilogram, but wet or green wood, which is what you'll actually find most of the time, has maybe half that energy content and produces so much smoke, you might as well light a beacon that says, "Come rob me." The science drop about water purification that nobody wants to hear is this. Boiling kills pathogens but does nothing for chemical contamination, heavy metals, or dissolved toxins. And in a collapse scenario where industrial facilities aren't maintained, where fuel depots leak, where agricultural runoff contains pesticides, your water sources will be contaminated with things boiling can't fix. This is why water purification tablets, specifically calcium hypochlorite and iodine tablets, become Barter gold. They're lightweight, they're shelf-stable for years, they're effective against the vast majority of waterborne pathogens, and they don't require fuel or time or equipment. A single bottle of 50 water purification tablets weighing maybe 2 ounces can purify 50 liters of water. That's 13 gallons. And costs about $8 today. But in month 6 of the collapse, when someone's kid is dying from giardia, they'll trade you things you can't imagine for a handful of those tablets. Here's what you need to stockpile. Calcium hypochlorite powder in bulk. This is pool shock, and it's the single most weight-efficient water purification method available to civilians. A 1-pound bag can purify 10,000 gallons of water if used correctly. Because you make a solution, and then dose that solution. This is chemistry. Calcium hypochlorite plus. Water produces hypochlorous acid, which is the active disinfectant, at a concentration of 2 to 4 parts per million. It kills bacteria, viruses, and protozoa within 30 minutes. You can buy a 50-pound bucket of this for under $100, and that bucket represents enough water purification capacity to keep a small community alive for years, and that, my friend, is why it becomes currency. The barter value is insane because water is non-negotiable. For human life, you die in 3 days without it, and contaminated water kills you almost as quickly through dysentery, cholera, or typhoid. So people will trade literally anything for the ability to make water safe. Third category, medicine and hygiene. And this is where the collapse gets medieval really fast because modern humans have no concept of what life was like before antibiotics, and you're about to get a crash course. The myth is that you'll just be more careful. You'll avoid injury. You'll wash your hands. You'll be fine. This is so naive it borders on delusional. Let me explain how bacterial infection actually works, because your understanding based on modern healthcare is catastrophically incomplete. Here's your microbiology lesson. Bacteria reproduce through binary fission. One cell becomes two cells. Every 20 to 30 minutes, depending on species and environmental conditions. This is exponential growth, and exponential growth is the most powerful force in nature. When you get a cut and bacteria enter the wound, you now have maybe 1,000 bacterial cells in your tissue. Sounds like nothing, right? Here's the math that kills you. After 1 hour, assuming 30-minute doubling time, you have 4,000 cells. After 2 hours, 16,000. After 4 hours, 256,000. After 8 hours, 16 million. After 12 hours, 1 billion. After 16 hours, 64 billion bacteria are actively consuming your tissue, producing toxins, and triggering systemic inflammatory response that cascades into sepsis. Sepsis is your own immune system going nuclear and killing you in the process of fighting infection. Your blood pressure crashes, your organs shut down, and you die in agony over days or weeks. This is how people died from simple cuts for all of human history until Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928. We've had less than 100 years of antibiotics, and you think you'll just avoid infection. You won't. In a collapse scenario, you're doing manual labor you're not conditioned for, using tools you're not trained with, in conditions that are unsanitary by necessity, and you're malnourished, which means your immune system is compromised. You're going to get cuts, puncture wounds, abrasions, and burns constantly. Without antibiotics, a significant percentage of those wounds become life-threatening infections. The historical mortality rate from compound fractures, where bone breaks through skin, was above 50%. That's a coin flip on whether you die. Think about that. This is why medical supplies become the most valuable barter category by far. People will trade you their food, their tools, their weapons, for something that saves their child's life. You need to stockpile fish antibiotics. Yes, you heard me correctly. Fish antibiotics, these are the exact same chemical compounds as human antibiotics. As amoxicillin is amoxicillin. Whether the bottle says for fish tanks or prescription only, same molecular structure, same mechanism of action, manufactured in the same facilities often. But fish antibiotics don't require a prescription, and they're shelf-stable for years past their expiration date. A bottle of 100 fish amoxicillin capsules costs about $20 and represents potentially 10 full treatment courses for bacterial infections. In a collapsed economy, each of those courses could be worth a month of food. I'm not exaggerating. Parents watching their children die from infection will give you everything they have. Here's what else you stockpile in the medicine category. Antiseptics like povidone iodine solution. This is broad spectrum and kills everything. Bacteria, viruses, fungi, protozoa. A single bottle lasts for dozens of wound treatments and costs $5. In barter, it's worth its weight in silver, literally. You stockpile painkillers. Not prescription opioids because those are illegal and attract the wrong attention, but large quantities of ibuprofen and acetaminophen. Pain is demoralizing. Pain destroys sleep, which impairs immune function. Pain makes people desperate. A bottle of 200 ibuprofen tablets costs $8 today and will trade for shocking amounts when someone has an infected tooth or broken bone. You stockpile anti-diarrheal medication like loperamide because diarrhea kills through dehydration and electrolyte imbalance. It's one of the top causes of death in collapse scenarios throughout history. A box of anti-diarrheal pills that cost $6 could save a life, and therefore has unlimited barter value. Now the hygiene items, this is where people laugh until they experience month 3 of the collapse and realize what they're missing. Toilet paper is the obvious one, and yes, people mock preppers for stockpiling it, but those people are idiots who've never gone 2 weeks without it. The average American uses 50 pounds of toilet paper per year. That's roughly 100 rolls per person. A family of 4 needs 400 rolls per year, and toilet paper takes up massive storage space and isn't produced locally anymore. It requires industrial pulp mills and chemical processing. The barter value of toilet paper becomes absurd because the alternatives are genuinely miserable. Using leaves means poison ivy risk and inadequate cleaning, which leads to infections. Using cloth means you're washing fecal-contaminated fabric by hand, which is exactly how cholera spreads. Toilet paper is dignity and sanitation in a package, and people pay premium rates for dignity when everything else is stripped away. Soap is the other critical hygiene item, and here's why. It's more important than you think. Soap isn't just about feeling clean. Soap is your primary defense against disease transmission. The chemistry of soap is what makes it work. Soap molecules are amphipathic, meaning they have one end that loves water and one end that loves fat. Bacterial cell membranes are made of lipid bilayers, which are fats. When you wash with soap, the hydrophobic ends of soap molecules penetrate bacterial membranes and can literally rip them apart, killing the bacteria. Then the hydrophilic ends let water carry away the debris. This is why hand washing with soap is more effective than hand sanitizer for many pathogens. In a collapse scenario where you're butchering animals, handling human waste for composting, treating wounds, and living in close quarters with poor sanitation, soap is what prevents typhoid, dysentery, and a dozen other fecal or oral transmission diseases that killed millions before we understood germ theory. A bar of soap costs $1 and lasts maybe 2 weeks with regular use. Stockpile hundreds of bars, they store forever, they're lightweight, and they'll trade for whatever you need when disease starts spreading through camps and communities of unprepared people. Fourth category, tools and repair items. This is where you prove whether you understand that the collapse isn't a 2-week camping trip. It's a permanent reversion to a lower technology state until industrial capacity rebuilds, which could take decades. The myth is that you'll have all the tools you need already. You've got a hammer and a screwdriver, you're set. Let me explain why that's laughable. In the modern world, when something breaks, you replace it. Your shoes wear out, buy new shoes. Your knife gets dull, buy a new knife. Your clothing tears, buy new clothing. You've never lived in an environment where a wrist replacement isn't an option and repair is mandatory. Here's the reality. In a post-collapse environment, your clothing takes catastrophic abuse. You're doing manual labor in it every day. You're crawling through brush. You're kneeling on concrete. You're exposed to sparks and chemicals and thorns. Clothing that used to last you 2 years will last 2 months, and when it tears you either repair it or you go naked because there are no clothing stores anymore. This is why sewing supplies become valuable barter items. Needles, thread, fabric patches, scissors. These enable repair, which extends the usable life of every textile item you own. The science drop here is about materials engineering and durability. Cotton thread has a tensile strength of about 50 to 80 megapascals. Polyester thread is stronger at around 80 to 100 megapascals. Nylon thread can exceed 100 megapascals. These differences matter because the stronger your repair, the longer it lasts before needing re-repair. A spool of heavy-duty thread costs $3 and contains maybe 100 meters. That's enough for hundreds of repairs. In barter, that spool trades for significant value because everyone's clothing is falling apart, and not everyone thought to stockpile sewing supplies. You need to stockpile fasteners, nails, screws, bolts, nuts, washers, in every common size. Why? Because everything built by humans uses fasteners, and fasteners are small items that get lost, stripped, corroded, or broken constantly. When your shelter develops a leak, you need nails to repair it. When your door hinge breaks, you need screws to fix it. When your cartwheel comes loose, you need bolts. Without fasteners, your infrastructure slowly disintegrates until you're living in ruins. The kicker is that manufacturing fasteners requires precision machining, metallurgy, and quality control that won't exist in the early collapse. Sure, someone with a forge can eventually make crude nails, but modern threaded fasteners, those require industrial capacity. A 5-pound bucket of assorted screws costs $30 and represents thousands of fasteners, each one potentially critical to a repair someone desperately needs. That's barter gold. Duct tape. This deserves its own paragraph because duct tape is borderline miraculous in its utility. It's a pressure-sensitive adhesive on a polyethylene-coated cloth, backing with a typical tensile strength around 20 pounds per inch width. It's waterproof, it's flexible, it adheres to almost everything, and it can temporarily repair an absurd range of failures. Your water container cracks, duct tape. Your tarp tears, duct tape. Your boot sole separates, duct tape. Your tool handle splits, duct tape. Obviously, these are temporary fixes, but temporary fixes buy you time to arrange proper repairs or replacements. A roll of quality duct tape costs $8 and lasts for dozens of repairs. In a barter economy, each repair someone can't do themselves represents trade value. Stockpile dozens of rolls and watch them become currency. Fifth category, and this is the one that makes people uncomfortable: vices and addictions, specifically tobacco, alcohol, and caffeine. The myth is that in a survival situation, people will give up their vices and focus on necessities. This is so wrong, and it's almost funny. Let me explain the neuroscience of addiction, and why you're about to make enormous profit from other people's weakness. Here's your biology lesson. Addictive substances work by hijacking your brain's reward system. Specifically, they cause massive release of dopamine in the nucleus accumbens, which is the brain region responsible for motivation and pleasure. With chronic use, your brain downregulates dopamine receptors to compensate for the artificially high levels. This is called tolerance. When you stop using the substance suddenly, you now have too few dopamine receptors for normal dopamine levels. This creates a dopamine deficit that manifests as depression, anxiety, irritability, inability to experience pleasure, physical pain, and intense cravings. This is withdrawal, and it's genuinely terrible. Now here's the key point. Withdrawal doesn't care that there's a collapse happening. Withdrawal doesn't care that you need to focus on survival. Withdrawal is a neurochemical process that makes you utterly miserable and desperate until you either suffer through weeks of it or you get your fix. The vast majority of people won't suffer through it. They'll trade whatever they must to make the withdrawal stop. This is why cigarettes become currency in prisons, in war zones, in every collapse scenario throughout history. A cigarette has no survival utility whatsoever. You can't eat it. It doesn't purify water. It doesn't provide warmth. It literally just delivers nicotine to satisfy an addiction. But a nicotine addict in withdrawal will trade you food they need to survive for that cigarette, because the immediate relief from withdrawal overrides rational and long-term thinking. You stockpile tobacco, not because you use it, but because roughly 38 million Americans smoke cigarettes, and when the supply chain breaks, those 38 million people are going into nicotine withdrawal simultaneously. A carton of cigarettes costs maybe $60 and contains 200 cigarettes. In a post-collapse barter economy, each individual cigarette could trade for a meal's worth of food. That's a 200x return on investment. The objection people raise is that tobacco goes stale. True, but stale tobacco still delivers nicotine. And nicotine is what addicts need. They'll smoke stale cigarettes without complaint. You store tobacco in vacuum-sealed bags with oxygen absorbers in a cool, dark place, and it remains usable for years. This is chemistry. The main degradation pathway for tobacco is oxidation. Remove oxygen, you dramatically slow degradation. Alcohol is the other vice with massive barter value, and alcohol has the advantage of being useful beyond just getting drunk. High-proof alcohol, anything above 60% alcohol by volume, functions as a disinfectant for wounds, as a solvent for tinctures and extractions, as a fuel for alcohol stoves, and as a trade good for people who want to forget how bad things are for a few hours. The science of alcohol as disinfectant is straightforward. Ethanol denatures proteins and dissolves lipids. This destroys bacterial cell membranes and viral envelopes. At concentrations between 60 and 90%, alcohol is highly effective against most pathogens. Below 60%, the water content is too high, and above 90%, it evaporates too quickly to maintain contact time. A bottle of vodka, or Everclear, costs $20 and serves multiple functions. In barter, it trades for premium value because it satisfies both practical needs and psychological ones. Caffeine is the vice people forget about. Until day 3 of withdrawal, when they have a migraine and can't focus, caffeine is the most widely used psychoactive substance on Earth. Roughly 80% of humans consume it daily. It works by blocking adenosine receptors in your brain, which prevents the drowsiness signal. With chronic use, your brain upregulates adenosine receptors to compensate. When you stop caffeine, suddenly you have too many adenosine receptors and you experience crushing fatigue, headaches, and brain fog that can last 2 weeks. Most regular coffee drinkers consume 200 to 400 milligrams of caffeine per day. That's 2 to 4 cups of coffee. When supply chains break and coffee becomes unavailable, you'll have hundreds of millions of people in caffeine withdrawal. And caffeine withdrawal makes you useless at precisely the moment you need to be sharp for survival decisions. You stockpile instant coffee. It stores for years in sealed containers. It's lightweight. It's energy dense in terms of caffeine per weight. And it will trade for absurd amounts, because caffeine isn't just about pleasure. It's about function. Someone pulling guard duty through the night needs caffeine to stay alert. Someone doing exhausting manual labor needs caffeine to maintain energy. A pound of instant coffee costs $10 and makes roughly 200 cups. Each cup could trade for meaningful value when people are desperate to function normally again. Tea is another option. Dried tea leaves store even longer than coffee and have similar caffeine content per cup. Plus, tea is easier to prepare with minimal fuel. A pound of black tea costs $12 and makes roughly 200 cups. Diversify your caffeine stockpile across both. Now let's talk about the psychology of barter and why most people fail at it even when they have the right supplies. The myth is that barter is simple. You have thing A, they have thing B, you swap, and everyone's happy. This ignores centuries of economic research on trade, currency, and human behavior. Let me explain why barter is actually incredibly inefficient and difficult. The fundamental problem is called the double coincidence of wants. In order for a barter transaction to occur, you need to find someone who has what you want and wants what you have at the same time. The probability of this occurring randomly is extremely low. Let's say you have a lighter and you want rice. You need to find someone who has rice and specifically wants a lighter right now, not someone who has rice and wants soap, not someone who has rice but doesn't smoke. You need exact overlap of desires, and that's rare. This is why currencies were invented. Currency solves the double coincidence problem by being universally desirable. Everyone accepts currency because they know everyone else accepts it. This creates liquidity, which enables trade. In a collapse, the question becomes what items achieve currency status by becoming universally desirable, and the answer is the 5 categories I've described: fire starters, water purification, medicine, tools, and vices, because these either address fundamental survival needs that everyone has, or they satisfy addictions that are widespread. The practical implication is that you should stockpile items across all 5 categories to maximize your trade flexibility. If you went all in on just lighters and the person you need to trade with doesn't smoke and has plenty of fire starters, you're stuck. But if you have a diversified stockpile, you can offer alternatives until you find something they need. Here's the social dynamics part that gets ugly. In a barter economy without rule of law, the person with the most violence capability often takes what they want without trading. This is the fundamental problem of collapse scenarios and why community matters more than stockpile size. A lone prepper with a basement full of supplies is a target. An organized community with shared defense and diversified skills is a survival unit. You need both supplies and social capital. The way you build social capital pre-collapse is by being useful, having skills people need, being trustworthy in small interactions, because when things fall apart, people remember who they can work with and who they can't. Your stockpile isn't just for your use. It's your bank account that you spend strategically to build alliances and trade relationships that increase your overall security. Let's talk about the timeline of collapse, and when each category becomes most valuable, because this affects your strategy. In the first 72 hours, people are still in denial. They think it's temporary. They're eating their perishables from the fridge and waiting for power to return. Barter isn't happening much yet. Days 4 through 14, people realize it's serious. Panic buying has stripped stores bare. People are burning through their pantries. The first wave of barter starts, and it's chaotic, with no established exchange rates. This is when fire starters and water purification will become immediately valuable, because people are cold and thirsty. Weeks 3 through 8 is when medicine becomes critical. People have been doing manual labor they're not conditioned for. Injuries are accumulating. Infections are starting. The first deaths from treatable conditions occur. If you have antibiotics and antiseptics, you can name your price. Months 3 through 6 is when tools and repair supplies become premium items. Everyone's equipment is breaking. Clothing is wearing out. Without repairs, their quality of life degrades rapidly. Sewing supplies and fasteners trade for high value. Months 6 through 12 vices become extremely valuable because people have stabilized their immediate survival, and now they're dealing with the psychological horror of indefinite collapse. They want alcohol to cope, tobacco to satisfy cravings, caffeine to function. The demand for vices actually increases over time as despair sets in. This timeline tells you to hold back premium items in the early days, when exchange rates haven't stabilized, and trade them later when people understand real value and are more desperate. Here's the accounting you need to do right now. Calculate your daily consumption rates for the 5 categories and multiply by number of people and number of days you want to prepare for. For fire starters, assume 1 lighter per person per year. For water purification, assume 50 tablets per person per year, or 1 pound of calcium hypochlorite per 5 people per year. For medicine, assume 1 antibiotic course per person per year, plus daily vitamins and pain medication. For tools, assume 10% of your fastener stockpile gets used per year, and 20% of your repair supplies. For vices, if you're trading them, assume you need enough to trade weekly, which means roughly 50 cigarettes per addict in your trade network per year. These numbers scale up rapidly when you're preparing for multiple people over multiple years, but the total cost is still less than 1 month of typical American consumer spending, and the return on investment in a collapse scenario is infinite, because you can't calculate ROI when the alternative is death. Storage is the other critical piece people mess up. Your stockpile is worthless if it gets destroyed by moisture, pests, or theft. Everything gets stored in multiple locations. You never put all your supplies in one place because fires happen, floods happen, theft happens, you need distributed redundancy. Critical items get buried in waterproof containers at GPS coordinates you've memorized. Secondary items go in hidden locations throughout your primary shelter. Tertiary items get cached at bug-out locations or trusted friends' properties. The psychology here is about not having single points of failure. Even if you lose 70% of your stockpile, the remaining 30% keeps you alive in trading. Let's address the moral objection people raise. They say it's wrong to profit from others' suffering during a collapse. They call it exploitation. This is naive moralism that ignores how economics actually works. Trade is not exploitation. Trade is mutually beneficial exchange, where both parties end up better off than they were before. You're not stealing from people. You're providing them with goods they desperately need in exchange for goods you need. This is how humans have cooperated for 10,000 years. The person who trades you food for antibiotics is happy to make that trade, because the antibiotics save their child's life, and the food is replaceable. You're happy because you need calories to survive. Both parties benefit. That's not exploitation, and that's civilization. The alternative to trade is violence, it's raiding, it's theft. Trade is the peaceful option, and you should be encouraging trade, not demonizing it. Here's the part where I tell you that your precious metals still have some value, but not in the way you think. Gold and silver won't trade for food in the first 6 months because food is immediately consumable and metals aren't. But after communities stabilize and start thinking beyond day-to-day survival, metals can serve as a store of value for large transactions, buying land, buying major equipment, settling debts. The key is that metals work only after a new equilibrium emerges, and only for transactions larger than daily barter handles efficiently. Trying to trade a gold coin for a loaf of bread doesn't work because the gold coin is worth too much and nobody can make change. But trading silver coins for a breeding pair of chickens might work because the values align better. The historical precedent for this is every currency collapse in history. In Weimar Germany, people traded wheelbarrows of paper marks for bread because the paper was worthless, but gold holders waited until hyperinflation ended and then bought property for pennies on the dollar. In Zimbabwe, people barter goods daily, but land transactions still use gold or US dollars. In Venezuela, people trade fish for flour, but property purchases involve US currency or occasionally precious metals. The lesson is that you need both. You need the 5 categories of barter items for daily survival and trade, and you need some precious metals for wealth preservation and large transactions later. But the ratio should be heavily skewed toward barter items, maybe 95% barter goods and 5% metals. Not the reverse, which is what most gold bugs recommend. Let's talk about skills, because items are worthless if you don't know how to use them or trade them effectively. You need to learn basic first aid before the collapse, not during. Knowing how to clean a wound properly, how to recognize infection, how to splint a fracture, how to treat burns. These skills make your medical supplies 10 times more valuable because you can offer treatment as a service. You need to learn basic sewing and repair skills. Being able to patch clothing or fix broken equipment means you can trade your labor when your supplies run low. You need to learn water purification techniques beyond just using tablets, understanding how to build sand filters, how to use the SODIS method with sunlight, how to distill water if needed. These skills enable you to help others, which builds social capital. The communications aspect is something most preppers completely ignore, and it's a critical vulnerability. In a grid-down collapse, your cell phone is a paperweight. The internet is gone. Radio might work if you have the equipment and knowledge. But most people will be isolated with no idea what's happening beyond their immediate area. This information vacuum is dangerous because you don't know where threats are coming from or where opportunities exist. You need battery-powered or hand-crank radios to receive emergency broadcasts. You need to understand radio basics so you can build simple receivers if necessary. You need to establish communication protocols with people in your network before the collapse, so you know where and when to meet if normal communication fails. Information itself becomes a valuable barter item if you know which roads are passable, which areas have resources, which groups are hostile. That information trades for goods and services because information reduces risk and enables better decisions. Here's the demographic analysis that affects your strategy. Different groups have different needs, and therefore different trade priorities. Families with young children need diapers and formula and children's medicine. These are high-value items to this demographic. Elderly people need medications for chronic conditions, blood pressure medication, diabetes medication, heart medication. If you can stockpile these legally, they trade for enormous value to elderly populations. Young single males are most likely to want tobacco and alcohol and need tools and weapons. Young women need hygiene products specific to menstruation. Pregnant women need prenatal vitamins and eventually baby supplies. Understanding your local demographic mix tells you what to stockpile extra of for barter. If you live near retirement communities, stockpile medications. If you live near young families, stockpile children's items. If you live near college towns, stockpile caffeine and vices. The security protocols for barter need to be ironclad, because trading advertises that you have supplies, which makes you a target. Never trade at your primary residence. Always use a neutral location that you can walk away from. Never trade alone. Always have backup watching from concealment. Never reveal the full extent of your stockpile. Trade small amounts and claim that's all you have. Never trade with people you don't know without serious precautions, because robbery disguised as trade is a common tactic. The first rule of collapse survival is operational security. The fewer people who know what you have, the safer you are. This means your barter activity needs to be carefully managed to avoid attracting attention from those who would rather rob than trade. Let's address the objection that this whole scenario is unrealistic, that modern societies don't collapse this way, that governments will maintain order and supply chains will adapt. This is normalcy bias, the cognitive error where you assume the future will resemble the past because that's your experience. But complex systems fail, and they fail rapidly when critical nodes break. The power grid is far more fragile than most people understand. It operates within very tight parameters of voltage and frequency. When generation doesn't match demand, exactly the system becomes unstable. A cascading failure can black out entire regions in minutes, and the Northeast blackout of 2003 affected 50 million people from a single failure point. The food supply chain operates on just-in-time logistics, with minimal warehouse inventory. Supermarkets stock about 3 days of food, regional distribution centers maybe 2 weeks. When transportation stops, the food pipeline empties faster than you think possible. We saw this during COVID-19 when relatively minor disruptions caused toilet paper shortages, meat shortages, panic buying that stripped shelves for weeks. And that was with government functioning and most infrastructure intact. Now imagine a scenario where the grid is down for months, where fuel shortages prevent trucking, where ports are closed, where farmers can't get fertilizer or seed. The cascade compounds exponentially, and suddenly you're in a genuine collapse scenario where barter becomes necessary. Venezuela collapsed from a functioning modern economy to people eating zoo animals in under 5 years. This is recent history, not ancient times. Argentina's economic collapse in 2001 saw middle-class families digging through trash for food. These things happen, and they happen faster than you think possible. The final piece is the psychological preparation that nobody wants to do, but is absolutely critical. You need to mentally prepare for a world where the rules you've lived by your entire life no longer apply, where property rights aren't enforced, where violence is common, where you might have to make choices you never imagined making. This isn't about becoming a psychopath. It's about understanding that survival and collapse requires harder decisions than survival and civilization. You might have to refuse to help someone, because helping them jeopardizes your family. You might have to trade with people you find morally reprehensible because they have resources you need. You might have to defend your supplies with violence because the alternative is your children starving. These are not easy thoughts, and most people avoid thinking about them, which is why most people fail when it matters. The time to wrestle with these moral questions is now, in the calm before, not in the moment of crisis when you're running on adrenaline and fear. Your gold isn't going to save you. Your stockpile of the 5 critical barter categories might. Your skills definitely will. And your community is what actually determines if you survive or become a statistic. Start acquiring these items now while they're cheap and available. Diversify your stockpile across categories, store them securely in multiple locations, learn the skills to use them, build the relationships that become your survival network, and prepare mentally for a world that's going to be darker and harder than anything you've experienced. The collapse might not come tomorrow, it might not come next year, but the trend lines all point toward increasing instability, climate change, resource depletion, political polarization, pandemic risk. These are not problems that get better with time, they compound until something breaks. When it breaks, you'll have about 72 hours before the reality sets in, and by then it's too late to prepare. The stores will be empty, the roads will be dangerous, your options will be limited to what you already have. So here's your action plan. Today you make a list of the 5 categories and you calculate your needs. Tomorrow you start buying. 1 extra box of lighters with your groceries, a bottle of water purification tablets, a box of bandages. It adds up faster than you think. Within 6 months you can have a solid foundation stockpile that puts you ahead of 99% of people. Within a year you can have enough to not only survive but to trade your way through the collapse and come out the other side with your family intact. This isn't paranoia. It's pattern recognition. It's understanding that complexity has a cost, and that cost comes due eventually. It's accepting that the abundance you've lived with isn't guaranteed forever, and that preparation is simply insurance against a future that's uncertain. Your gold will be worthless, but your lighters, your water towers, your antibiotics, your tools, and yes, even your cigarettes and instant coffee, those will be the new currency. And if you're smart, you're accumulating them right now.